Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa. So, to introduce this lecture, who was Margaret Mead? What was Mead's contributions to the study of culture and issues of gender, sexuality, and kinship? What was the significance of her ethnography, Coming of Age in Samoa? We're going to explore these questions. Margaret Mead was clearly one of the most famous anthropologists of the 20th century. She had a huge impact on public debate. She's very important in the study of gender and women's issues because she explored how differences in men and women's behavior vary cross-culturally, as we can say, are culturally constructed. When she compared, for example, gender roles and norms in the United States differed from Chambuli women in Papua New Guinea. Chambuli women tended to take a more masculine role in their tribal society. Her classic text, Coming of Age in Samoa, published very early in the history of cultural anthropology and ethnographic publishing, 1928, it explored the psychology, really, of individuals within the context of culture. It was extensively researched with fieldwork, with ethnographic fieldwork. And even today, there's publicly accessible field notebooks and diaries of all her observations from her research. She related Samoan adolescents to those of the United States, and argued that Samoan adolescents did not have the strife and conflict of those in the U.S. We can think about methods, we can think about theory, we can think about ethics in the text itself. It is a landmark of the use of participant observation and interviews in ethnographic research. Mead, in a theoretical sense, was arguing that American experiences of adolescence are not somehow universal or biologically inevitable, but rather they were closely related. They were rather closely related to cultural factors. In comparison, Samoan attitudes towards sexuality, for example, allowed for more experimentation around sex and less guilt or anxiety during adolescence. There was less pressure towards marriage and careers. And so the transition to adulthood, that adolescence, was different in Samoa and was not simply determined by biology. There have been ethical issues raised about the degree to which she misrepresented Samoan culture to fit her theory. She was interested in the cultural relativism of adolescence, and going in with that framework, there has been a debate in anthropology to the extent to which that also distorted the data that she collected. Regardless, she really was an important anthropologist that impacted public debates. The text itself, descriptive and comparative between Samoa and the U.S., had a textual style that was incredibly accessible and was very popular among the general reading public. In fact, probably had a text style that has been more accessible in many ways than many other anthropologists, and in this sense is quite a landmark in anthropology for public anthropology. In the next clip, you're going to see a documentary on Margaret Mead from the Strangers Abroad series. This series from the mid-1980s looks at some of the first anthropologists like Margaret Mead to kind of stop armchair theorizing and simply using the materials that are already available, let's say, in libraries, and to go out and actually do field work with people themselves. It's a good kind of quick summary for Margaret Mead's coming of age in Samoa.
A young American anthropologist called Margaret Mead, the suggestion that life out here had less of that stress and strain was an important one. In 1925, she came here to Tau Island to make, in her own words, a psychological study of primitive youth for Western civilization. She wanted to know if adolescence was always a time of turmoil. Throughout her career, Mead was intrigued by the key stages that all humans pass through as they're born into and grow up in their own cultures. Boaz was at the centre of the nature-nurture debate, the question of whether your race or your culture makes you into what you are. He wanted Mead to study one particular period of life when these biological and social aspects caused most conflict: adolescence.
Most of the gloom about adolescence had come from Germany. They had these terrible words like Weltschmerz, world pain. So that everywhere in the world you were supposed to have an awful time growing up. Nobody knew anything about adolescence in Samoa or Hawaii or the Marquesas or Tahiti. We didn't know anything.
Margaret Mead came out here to investigate adolescence in a society completely different from her own. Her findings were startling. Adolescence was known in America and Europe as a period of emotional stress and personal conflict. Now, if these problems were caused by biological changes, and many at the time believed that they were, then they should be found in human societies all over the world. But here in Samoa, Mead found that adolescence was, in many ways, the most enjoyable and happy time of life. There were many reasons for this. For a start, she found that the culture itself was pretty relaxed and casual. Then there was the whole system of child rearing with its lack of harsh punishment and the large number of adults a child could turn to. The other important reason was the general acceptance of sexual relations between adolescents. Sex was seen as something to be enjoyed in quantity as well as quality before you chose a partner for life.
I was to learn the language and get acquainted with the adolescent girls and find out what they were up to.
Margaret Mead died of cancer in America in 1978. It's interesting to see how her own culture evaluated her life and achievements. These press clippings from just after she died call her a pioneer and an innovator, grandmother of us all, America's apple pie anthropologist, Earth Mother, grandmother to the world, and a matron saint. Mead's success as a popular anthropologist was astonishing.
So to conclude, Margaret Mead was one of the most famous anthropologists of the 20th century, and she was a very important theorist in gender and sexuality, really progressive for the time in which she was writing. She was a relativist and sought to understand cultural practices within their own context, as opposed to, let's say, using theories about the determination of race and biology. For example, one of the most significant impacts she made was on understanding adolescence and experiences of sexuality. She made the argument that adolescents, let's say in the United States and Samoa, are not just universal processes that are determined by biology. And in fact, in Samoa, unlike we might assume from a Eurocentric or American-centric kind of lens, was in fact a more peaceful and harmonious life stage. That there were unique ideas and practices in Samoa that allowed adolescents to live a more peaceful and harmonious life.